They had never fired a shot in anger before, and now these young British soldiers were about to step into one of the deadliest battles in history. They knew nothing about what lay ahead of them, but even if they had known, they wouldn't have believed it. No one could believe the horror that was going to unfold at the Battle of the Somme. It is often considered the worst military disaster in British history, with more than 60,000 British soldiers killed or wounded in a single day. So what exactly happened there? What was the significance of this battle? How did it become so deadly? And how did survivors cope with their memories afterwards? To understand this horrific battle, we first have to go back to World War I. Germany had already been fighting for 3 years when the British Expeditionary Force arrived on the Western Front in late 1914. At this point, the Germans had made significant progress and were pushing towards Paris. But thanks to the British, the French were able to regroup. The Allies then started planning an attack to take back land from the Germans and began fortifying trenches across France. These trenches stretched for miles and became home to thousands of soldiers on both sides. They became a key part of life on the front lines, but also became synonymous with the horrors of war. These conditions were absolutely dreadful. Soldiers slept in dirty, cramped spaces, and the threat of rats and lice constantly loomed over them. Food was scarce, as were supplies, and everyone was exhausted all of the time. Add to this the fact that the enemy was only meters away from you at all times, ready to fire at any moment, and you can see why people went insane. For many of those fighting in the trenches, it felt like an endless game of cat and mouse. One wrong move, and you could be shot dead. Sometimes the only thing separating you from death was a thin layer of mud and a bit of wire. It was no wonder that after just a few weeks, many soldiers were suffering from trench foot, trench coat, and trench mouth. Shell shock was also widespread. Some men would scream and shout for hours without stopping, while others couldn't speak at all. So, in an effort to break the stalemate, the British High Command decided to launch a massive offensive at the Somme. The goal was to push back the Germans and capture the town of Péronne, which was just 5 miles from the British lines. To do this, they amassed an army of more than 500,000 men. This was one of the largest armies ever assembled up to this day. There was just one problem, though. The British commander, Sir Douglas Haig, had no real plan of action. He just hoped that by throwing enough men and resources at the problem, they would win. After weeks of preparation, the British and French began their assault on July 1st, 1916. The French attacked first, but they soon found themselves under heavy fire. Within minutes, casualties began piling up. Then it was the British turn. As the men moved out of their trenches, they were met with a horrifying scene. The French were lying dead or wounded everywhere. Many were too scared to move forward, but they had no choice. They had to advance or risk being killed where they stood. As they moved forward, thousands of men were mowed down. Those who weren't killed outright were wounded and fell anyway. After just an hour of fighting, more than 20,000 British soldiers were dead. Throughout the day, Haig kept telling his men to attack and take the village at all costs. By the end of the day, 60,000 British soldiers had been killed or wounded, and they hadn't even reached the German lines. Over the next 4 days, the British managed to get a little closer to the Germans, but they suffered heavy losses every step of the way. It seemed like no matter how hard they tried, they just couldn't make any progress. Haig realized that he needed a new tactic, so he called off the attacks and started making new battle plans. On July, the British launched a new assault. This time they were helped by the Australians and the New Zealanders. Together, they managed to advance a little further than before, but again, they took heavy losses. By the end of the month, more than 300,000 British soldiers had been killed. The worst part was that they still hadn't broken through the German lines. So in August, the British tried again. This time they were successful. They managed to break through the German lines and push them back, but the victory was short-lived. Within a few days, the Germans had regrouped and launched a counterattack. The British were pushed back to where they had started. The fighting continued like this for months. The Allies would attack and advance a little, then the Germans would counterattack and push them back. By the time the fighting ended on November, more than 100,000 men had been killed or wounded. This was the worst battle in the history of the British Army. It was also one of the worst battles in human history. The fighting had taken place over a narrow stretch of land just 6 miles wide and 3 miles deep. It was a scene of unimaginable carnage. Dead bodies were strewn across the landscape, rotting in the sun. The ground was soaked in blood. The air was filled with the stench of death. But amidst all this carnage, some men still managed to survive. They survived the shelling, the machine gun fire, the poison gas attacks. They survived the horrors of no man's land, the long, cold nights in the trenches, the hunger, the thirst, the constant fear of death. These men were true survivors. They had seen things that no one should ever have to see. They had done things that no one should ever have to do. They had fought in one of the deadliest battles in history. When they came back home, they tried to put their experiences behind them. They got on with their lives, they married, had children, got jobs, but they could never escape the memories of the Somme. They spent the rest of their lives haunted by the ghosts of their past. One survivor, Wilfred Owen, wrote about his experience in poetry. His work is some of the most powerful and moving writing to have ever come out of the First World War. Another survivor, Siegfried Sassoon, wrote a series of poems that were equally powerful. These men were able to cope with their memories by expressing them in art. But not everyone was so lucky. Many survivors simply shut down. They never spoke about what they had seen or done. They buried their memories deep inside them and tried to forget they ever happened. But no matter how hard they tried, the memories wouldn't go away. They came back to haunt them in their nightmares. They saw the dead faces of their friends everywhere they went. They heard the screams of the dying in the wind. They smelled the stench of death in the rain. The memories of the Somme followed these men for the rest of their lives. And even though it's been almost 100 years since the battle took place, the memories are still with us today. The Battle of the Somme is remembered in books, in films, in museums, in memorials. We tell the story of the Somme to remember those who died. We remember the bravery of those who fought. We remember the horror of what took place there. And we ask ourselves why. Why did so many men have to die? What was the point of it all? The Battle of the Somme was one of the most pointless battles in history. It achieved nothing, it changed nothing, it was a complete waste of life. But that's the way war is. War is always pointless, it's always a waste of life, and yet people keep fighting wars to this day. They say that those who don't learn from the past are doomed to repeat it. But are we really learning anything from the past, or are we just letting the same mistakes happen over and over again? If you want to know more about the Battle of the Somme, check out the video here. And if you want to know more about World War I, check out the playlist here. Thank you for watching and see you next time.